guys not see that you guys are the enforcers of the establishment and smear any outsider that challenges the status quo?
Do I think some people in the mainstream media are too close to like people in power? Absolutely. And I think the lack of investigative work, and also to your point, the lack of acknowledging they didn't do that investigative work is a media failure.
Now, joining us is national political correspondent for Axios, Alex Thompson, who co-authored Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. It's the book that he co-authored with Jake Tapper. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Long-time viewer, first time, I guess, I don't know, like not caller, but whatever this is.
Thank you so much. So first of all, let me just commend you for doing the type of reporting that most journalists were unwilling to do. You were one of the few who was calling out the real issues with the Biden administration and his mental decline before anyone else was willing to do it. But you also rightly criticized the mainstream media for missing the Biden mental decline story entirely. And I have to ask you, one of those people was Jake Tapper, right? Of course, that infamous moment with Laura Trump where he denied that Biden had mental decline, said that he just had a stutter. Why did you decide to co-author this book with him?
I just really disagree with that. The Jake Tapper clip that you're referencing was in 2020. The Joe Biden in 2020 was not the same Joe Biden as 2023. I'd also say the reason I decided to do this with Jake is because this book was his idea. He was the one that approached me and said, I think there's more to the story beyond what we saw at this debate. And, basically exactly a year ago now. And I also, there are many, to your point, there are many journalists in Washington, D.C. that I would have said no to about doing a book on this topic. Jake Tapper is not one of them. Jake has said that he feels he fell short on this part of the Biden story. But whenever you're on sort of a beat, the reporters that are tough, the ones that are go soft. Jake was never one of those when it came to Biden. I think you can look at his coverage of the Afghanistan withdrawal and many other topics. I also, as I was, covering Biden pretty tough, not just in the H stuff, but on other things, not in an unfair way, but just an adversarial, regular way. Jake was one of my foremost, advocates within CNN. So it never really was a second thought in my mind.
That's fair. And, to be fair to Jake Tapper, he was very apologetic and remorseful of that, moment with Laura Trump and says that he apologized to her, but to follow up on that question, what is your sense of what transpired with mainstream media and their unwillingness to cover Biden's mental decline? Do you think that they were just in the dark and they didn't want to scratch beneath the surface? Do you think that there is maybe a partisan divide in the media that caused them to avoid covering the story? I'm curious what your read of it is.
A great question. And the thing is that the mainstream media is not a monolith. So indulge me, because I'm going to say there's a few different factors at play. One is I do think that people let their ideological leanings affect their reporting of Joe Biden. They were, anti-Trump or, pro sort of like big D Democrat. But I think that actually makes the story too simplistic. I also think in Washington, D.C., I'm sure I know you've been here several times. It's a company town, and it's also a very liberal town, and also a very big D Democrat way. And there is not if you are a tough Trump reporter in Washington, D.C., you are invited to every single ambassador residence party in town. You are heralded around town. There's not the same social reward for covering, and covering, Joe Biden stuff. Or honestly, I know you have your issues with him, but like the way that Jake Tapper also covered Obama in a lot of ways during his presidency, and I do think that also affected the reporting, and that. People, and I also think it affected the reporting. I know you guys have talked about this in the past. I think it in some ways affected the mainstream, for lack of a better term, the mainstream media is reporting on Bernie Sanders as well.
Yeah, so Alex, let's keep it real, okay? So I think mainstream media are the thugs who are the enforcers of the establishment. And so it's not about liberal or conservative or even Republican or Democrat. In my lifetime, mainstream media has loved establishment Republicans and Democrats, anyone who's in favor of the status quo, anyone who's in favor of corporations, and anyone who's an outsider is treated with enormous disdain, whether they're on the left or the right. And so that's why when people challenged Biden's competency, and it wasn't just right wingers, we did it. We started a petition back in 2023, not 24, 23, and thousands of Young Turks members and audience members signed it. I had a protest candidate run against him, Marianne Williamson. You guys just treat like as she's dirt. She was right all along. Dean Phillips was viciously attacked by mainstream media, and he was a US congressman and right all along. Do you guys not see that you guys are the enforcers of the establishment and smear any outsider that challenges the status quo?
I mean, I don't see myself in that way, and
No, I'm not saying you, Alex. Hold on, let me be clear, because
am I part of the mainstream media or not?
No, so let me be clear. So we gave you credit before you wrote the book, okay? Because you were the exception to the rule, right? I'm asking you about the rule.
Do I think some people in the mainstream media are too close to like people in power? Absolutely. Do I think that Dean Phillips's candidacy was covered accurately or sufficiently? Absolutely not. I mean, I don't even believe that MSNBC had him on their network until it was clear that he absolutely was not going to win. At the end of the day, though, I also think that, at the end of the day, the people that lied about this were the people in the Biden administration.
Right.
And
I don't think so, Alex. I disagree with you guys. So I get it. The Biden administration lied about it. I'm not disputing that part, right? But really, no reporter other than you could see that he was super old and couldn't finish sentences and was shaking hands with invisible people on stage? No one could see that? Then shouldn't they all be fired? Aren't they deeply incompetent at a bare minimum? Because Alex, the reason why I asked that is because they're not deeply incompetent. Their job is to protect the status quo. So if anyone challenges someone like Biden, it's the job of cable news anchors, and by the way, New York Times and Washington Post writers, to look down their nose at him and go, how dare you?
Okay.
Wait, hold on, no, I want him to answer that question. Do you not see that? Because the whole rest of the country sees that.
I just want to add to your question because look, Alex, you stand out, right? Like you stand out as novel in this whole situation because you were willing to report something that the whole of mainstream media kind of turned a blind eye to. And that's an indictment of our journalism here in the United States, that you have one person who really shines or stands out for his willingness to not just take the party line as truth, but to actually dig in and see what the reality is.
Which question should I take?
So take the one, are they all incompetent? Or do they, like I'm asking, like, do they don't acknowledge it at all, right? Like they find me to be outrageous and radical for saying that they're ass kissers of the powerful, right?
I mean, listen, like I made a speech when I won an award at the White House Correspondents' Dinner earlier this year for my reporting on this topic. And I went up there and I said, because it felt weird to win an award from Washington, DC reporters for something that I thought was sort of a collective media, if you want to call it failure or letdown, whatever. And most of the reaction I've heard from that speech since was defensiveness. So, I agree with you. That being said, I do think there is a distinction we should point out here, which is there is a difference between covering the fact that, like, yes, Joe Biden was like shaking hands with people that weren't there. He was talking about members of Congress who had died, 3 weeks before. He was having trouble articulating his thoughts and walking, quite literally. And those things, while they maybe have been underplayed by the media, those were showed by the media. Also, the media did talk about his age regularly as a political liability. Now, what the media did not do at large, and there are exceptions to this besides myself, but then what the media at large did not do was look at how the fact that how his age was affecting his ability to do his job. And the fact that he was clearly, including by the people around him, was not necessarily capable of doing the job till January of 2029, which is what he was asking voters to do. And I think the lack of investigative work, and also to your point, the lack of acknowledging they didn't do that investigative work, is a media failure.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about those who are actually engaged in the cover up within the Trump administration. I'm sorry, the Biden administration, Freudian slip, because I see it as two separate camps, right? I think that there were some Democrats in the party, whether they be in Congress or some other government agency, who legitimately were in the dark, did not know what was going on. But those closest to the Biden administration obviously clearly knew what was going on. You kind of get into that in the book. So name some names, because obviously people like Jill Biden stand out. Her top aide, Bernal, stands out. Talk about what they were doing in order to engage in this cover up.
As Joe Biden's decline became worse and worse, and there were clear signs of it as far back. I mean, you all covered it during the 2020 Democratic primary. The Joe Biden of 2019 was not the same as Joe Biden of 2015. That also, the Joe Biden of 2023 was much worse than the Joe Biden of 2019. And as Joe Biden's decline became more significant, the circle of advisors closed in around him and restricted access more and more. We had a senior White House official confess to us that essentially, as the decline became worse, especially in the late 2023, that the people around him kept everyone else at bay in order to hide the extent of the decline. So you want names. So yes, you mentioned Anthony Bernal, Jill Biden's top aide, N.A. Tomasini, who was one of the top aides to Joe Biden, but also is in some ways a Bernal deputy, Ashley Williams. All these people have been called to testify before the House Oversight Committee. You also have Steve Ricchetti, Mike Donilon, Bruce Reed. Those are the people that have been around Biden for the longest, had tons of access to him. And the thing that's really striking is how much power so few people had within this White House, and how few people actually had regular access in a way that really is extraordinary. And they would always say oh, well, everyone always wants access to the president. No, the number of people that had access to Joe Biden was very, very small in comparison to most modern presidents.
Yeah. So look, this is why I get so frustrated with mainstream media, because if you dare challenge Dr. Jill Biden before the debate, you would have been smeared. You would have had a character assassination against you. How dare you? That is the first lady, and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, she dragged her, husband, who's in massive cognitive decline, out on stage and said, go, do this, embarrass yourself. I don't care, I wanna stay in power. So look, two things come out of that, Alex. One, I mean, they're never gonna do it. I don't know why I bother asking, but can mainstream media ever challenge the powerful? Or no. Dr. Jill Biden, right? I mean, she's borderline evil in what she did to Joe Biden. And let alone all those other advisors who did it for profit. Because if Joe Biden was out of office, even if it's another Democrat, they're not in the White House anymore. They don't have power, they don't have profit, right? They were such egomaniacs. But also the entire Democratic leadership. Has anyone asked them, hey, you guys said Trump was a danger to democracy. That's why I did the petition, that's why I did the run, that's why I covered it so much. Because I actually believe that Trump is authoritarian in nature. So, but Alex, did they ever confess, any of those people, Jill Biden, through Jamie Harrison, through every Democratic leader, they were lying. They never thought Trump was a danger to democracy. They thought bowing their heads to Joe Biden was so much more important than beating Donald Trump.
Actually, I would just say in some ways, it's the opposite of what you said, in that they do sincerely believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy, and they also believed in the same breath. And this is not necessarily Jill Biden, but some of the other people you were referencing, other aides, believe they would never change Joe Biden's mind, and if they ever did speak out, then it was only going to help Donald Trump. And if you believe Donald Trump's an existential threat to democracy, and even if it means putting in at times an old man in the Oval Office for 4 more years, it's still better than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
The threat of Donald Trump is what allowed them to rationalize what was actually sort of completely irrational.
Yeah, so they're like, oh, we have a madman running, so why don't we back the other madman, the guy who's lost his mind and has no chance of beating him? Yeah, I don't believe them. Well, I think they're traitors. I think that I mean, that's a heavy language. I don't mean it in like the right-wing way and they should be arrested or something. No, I don't mean that. But yeah, they didn't care about the country. They didn't care about the party. They were all egomaniacs who wanted to retain their power. But so, Alex, who was actually in charge of the country? Because obviously Joe Biden wasn't. Did Jill Biden run domestic policy and Anthony Blinken run foreign policy? And people have a legitimate right to ask, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, who actually runs the government? Donald Trump doesn't read, right? He can't read past the page. He watches Fox News all day. Joe Biden didn't even have a brain left. Who runs the goddamn country?
I mean, cabinet members, given that Joe Biden had extraordinary limitations to his energy. One member of the cabinet said, listen, he's an old man, 4 or 6 good hours a day. As a result, that means that a lot of the staff had much more power. Now, Jill Biden did not have like a very strong policy agenda when she was there. Like, her role was more so, what does Joe want? And I'm going to be the enforcer. And yeah, I do also, according to people that has spent time with her and people in the White House, I think she also fell in love with the life. I don't think she was trying to enact a distinct policy agenda, though. Beyond that, Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were clearly the two most powerful people in American foreign policy. When it came to American domestic policy, I would say Steve Ricchetti and Bruce Reed were certainly the most powerful people. And then when it came to Joe Biden's political agenda, I would say Mike Donilon first and foremost, and then a little bit below that would be communications guru, for lack of a better term, Anita Dunn.
Alex, I know you have a heart out, so I'll just end on this. What really stood out to me about your book was just how, I guess, retaliatory those in Biden's orbit were toward media that wanted to ask the right questions. And I remember a distinct moment, it's outlined in the book, where Kamala Harris even was shocked at the hard questions that she was being asked when she made an appearance on CNN. And final question for you, do you believe that maybe the lack of access to these politicians could be playing a role in journalists' decisions to kind of be hands off or maybe avoid digging a little deeper when they suspect that these politicians are lying to them?
Yes. I mean, like there's an access game in DC, and increasingly politicians, not just Joe Biden, Donald Trump, conservatives, liberals, are increasingly going to media outlets they think are going to be favorable or kinder or just nicer and give them softballs. And I think sometimes the access game in mainstream media does play a role. That being said, I want to also the reason why I'm here, and I think there's room for people like the Young Turks, people like on the right as well. I think that there's room for both here, but I also do really strongly believe, and it's why I still work at a place like Axios that had my back the entire way doing this Biden story, is because I still believe there is an important role for mainstream reporters. Doesn't mean we don't mess up. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't take accountability and be more accountable about our mistakes. But I do think there's room for both, and it's important to have both.
Oh, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I only half agree. I agree if mainstream, I agree if mainstream media was actually trying to do objective journalism and actually challenge the powerful. But other than you and a couple of other guys, I see the exact opposite. I view them to be deeply counterproductive, the Praetorian Guard of the establishment and the status quo and corporate rule. So no, I don't have a lot of interest in mainstream media. But
Cenk, mainstream media, they do. There is investigative reporting that we literally cover and talk about on this show. We wouldn't be able to do our jobs without the actual journalists who go out in the field and they gather the news.
I know, Associated Press, Reuters, good text journalists, good journalists like Alex, etc. Cable news is a wasteland of propaganda for status quo. And New York Times and Washington Post, and yes, Axios Political oftentimes are terrible. All they do is the donor class is great. Oh, money in politics, I don't know it. What is that? Oh, gee, I wonder if AIPAC affects things. I wonder if big pharma affects legislation. I wonder if rich people taking money affects this bill that's going on. Of course they do. It's a show, Alex. It's theater. Anyways, but the book is good. And Alex was good in covering Biden before the book. The book is called Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. Alex, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex.
I appreciate I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for the conversation. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.